we know through looking at history that the household composition and the economics of that have changed over the last 120 years. I'm on record as saying that I think, there was in the early sort of federation forming time, Melbourne, by way of example, had between 7 to 9 people per household in those, terrace houses down in South Melbourne and through Port Melbourne. They're obviously still a young, evolving country back then. We have seen that household formation change a lot. How much do you see that playing into this story of supply and, versus place to live versus expectation on being able to live in your own property by way of example?
That's a really interesting point, because you could argue that whether or not you supply more property, that could be absorbed by additional demand through lower average household size. We saw a really interesting example of that through the pandemic period, where the average household size went from 2.6 people to 2.5 people on average, roughly, and it added to dwelling demand by 120,000 properties, as estimated by the RBA. And that was amid international border closures. We weren't seeing a massive increase in population. So, what it highlights for me is that there is a very important demand element, and that perhaps the conversation around housing affordability has almost veered too much towards the supply element. I think the pendulum is swinging back to demand at the moment, especially in light of the stage 3 tax cut reforms, where more conversations are being had around tax reforms to assets, negative gearing, capital gains concessions, land tax versus stamp duty. Uh, it's the demand piece that's going to be operating here as well, because if we can get people to actually occupy houses more efficiently, that's going to save us having to build more homes.
I think it's an excellent point. I mean, ultimately, that's the law of economics and seeing where price elasticity works and where affordability works. We're seeing right now, obviously, new formations or greater formation of housemate or house sharing as obviously rents get too expensive for some households, especially, obviously in light of the costs increases that are being experienced by investors. We're talking obviously significant increases in terms of interest rates, but we're also seeing double-digit increases in insurance costs. And finally, some of the minimum standards that are also being introduced, adding thousands or of dollars towards those holding costs. So it really is important to recognise that these types of changes have direct and indirect consequences around how the economics work and then ultimately how the market performs.